Batya, what's on your radar?
Crime has emerged as one of the top issues on voters' minds in the lead up to the midterm elections, now just 2 weeks away. Fully 80% of Americans told Gallup pollsters that they are worried about crime, including 43% of Democrats who worry about crime a great deal. A Morning Consult political poll found similar numbers. Over 3/4 of respondents said violent crime is a major problem in the United States, with 60% saying crime would play a major role in who they vote for in November. And a News Nation poll of registered voters found that 85% of respondents said crime was either somewhat or very important to their decision about who they would vote for. From Minnesota to New York to Philadelphia to Texas to Oklahoma, voters are worried about their safety. They are right to worry. Homicides rose 5% last year, as did aggravated assaults, while gun assaults have increased by 8%. The murder rate is 44% higher than it was in 2019. Burglary is down from last year, but carjacking is up by 14%, and domestic violence is up by 4%. And it's impacting races across the country. In New York, Republican Lee Zeldin is closing in on Kathy Hochul in the race for governor, putting him in spitting distance of a role that a Republican hasn't held for 20 years. It's a feat he accomplished by focusing much of his campaign on crime, a theme for which the city provided him ample fodder. Crime then came home for Zeldin, quite literally. There was a shooting outside his house a few weeks ago while his teenage daughters were home, and he himself was accosted by an assailant holding a knife-like object on stage at a campaign.
There's only one option. No. You're done. You're done. You're done. You are done.
Whoa! Whoa!
Zeldin's assailant was released almost immediately without bail, a perfect example of the theme of the Zeldin campaign. In response, the New York Times published an article pushing a conspiracy theory about whether Zeldin supporters were behind his assailant's release. It later emerged that the man was a veteran and an addict, and he is now in rehab, something Zeldin condoned. For her part, Hochul has pushed for a rollback of the controversial progressive bail reform law, and her latest ad focused on crime. Let's watch that.
A safe walk home at night, a subway ride free of fear, a safer New York for every child. That's what Kathy Hochul is working for as governor, and she passed a comprehensive crime plan to make it happen. It goes after illegal guns to make our neighborhoods safer, toughens bail laws to keep repeat offenders off our streets, and gets help for the homeless and those suffering with mental illness.
You deserve to feel safe, and as your governor, I won't stop working until you do.
If Hochul wins, she will have done so by at least making a show of caring about crime, which meant breaking with progressives on the issue. But New York was just one of many races that zeroed in on crime, something both Republicans and Democrats have mentioned in campaign ads, with Democrats actually bringing up crime even more than Republicans. It was the third most common theme in their ads, as opposed to the fourth for Republicans. But Republicans are clearly seen by voters as the party that cares more about the issue and has a better chance of tackling it, which is no surprise given that high-profile Democrats and progressives have repeatedly dismissed voters' concerns with crime, casting the fears of regular Americans as hysteria, a reflection of conservative fear-mongering. You have to wonder, is it really wise to gaslight voters and tell them they're wrong to care about what they're telling you they care about? Crime has become the new what's the matter with Kansas, except now instead of accusing people of being hypnotized by conservative media into voting against their economic interests, progressives accuse working class Americans experiencing a real rise in violent crime of inventing the cars that have been jacked, the purses that have been snatched, the beatings they've sustained on the subway, and the loved ones they have lost to a rising murder rate. The latest tactic of the progressive blue check Twitterati has been to point out that the murder rate has risen mostly in states that voted for Donald Trump. They've taken to calling the rise in crime the, quote, red state murder problem to reflect the fact that the top 10 murder rates in the U.S. are almost all in states that Donald Trump won. This talking point became a flashpoint during a gubernatorial debate in Oklahoma last week, when the Democratic candidate Joy Hoffmeister pointed out that Oklahoma has a higher murder rate than New York. Watch.
The fact is, the rates of violent crime are higher in Oklahoma under your watch than in New York and California. That's a fact.
Well, we'll have that fact checked by the Frontier Superintendent.
It's also a fact that
Hang
medical
on,
marijuana...
Oklahomans, do you believe we have higher crime than New York or California? That's what she just said.
Safety and security is my top priority, and it will be as governor.
It's an interesting clip because Hofmeister is technically correct. Oklahoma does have a higher murder rate than New York. But when Governor Kevin Stitt got the audience to laugh at Hofmeister based on how they feel about that data point, they weren't wrong either, because murder in red states is extremely concentrated in cities with Democratic mayors and in specific communities. And this is the part that Democrats don't want to talk about. Progressives are right that New York City and California don't rank high in murder per 100,000 people. And they are right that the top 10 murder rates per 100,000 in the U.S. are in places like Mississippi, Louisiana, Kentucky, Alabama, Missouri, and South Carolina. The South has historically always been more violent, the result of what social psychologist Richard E. Nisbett called the culture of honor, in which a man's reputation is central to his economic survival, which makes violent retaliation against symbolic slights more of a norm in the South than elsewhere. We also know that poverty is intimately correlated with violent crime, and southern states continue to rank poorer than northern ones. And it's true that rural America has also seen a rise in murder rates since the pandemic began, up to 25%. And yet, when you look at the cities that have the highest murder rate per 100,000, they are cities led by Democratic mayors: Philadelphia, Memphis, Detroit, Milwaukee, Atlanta, Kansas City, Louisville. Take these cities out of the equation and the murder rate in those red states plummets. Worse, if you look at the FBI's new crime data, which was released on October 5th, it's clear that a disproportionately high percentage of murder victims are Black Americans. Take Oklahoma, a state that's over 70% white and just 7% Black, yet Black Americans represented 36% of the victims of homicide in Oklahoma. Or take Louisiana, a state that is 32% Black, in which Black Americans represented fully 77% of the homicide victims, according to this data. In Mississippi, Black Americans represented over 80% of the victims of homicide. New York is just 15% Black, but Black Americans represented 65% of homicide victims, the FBI data shows. The FBI data also shows that, as in other cases, the vast majority of this crime is intraracial, meaning it is committed by people of the same race as their victims. Look, it's important to bear in mind that the FBI data is incomplete. The FBI is completing the process of switching from a system that counted criminal episodes with one that counts individual crimes, and not all precincts have reported their statistics yet. But what data we have is appalling. There is a massacre going on of people who have an 80% likelihood of being Democratic voters. It's rather cynical, given this data, to crow about a red state murder problem. What could possibly justify the erasure of these victims from the public discourse on the left? There are a number of reasons that I believe Democrats and progressives don't want to talk about crime. For starters, of course, it's always difficult to take responsibility that's happening on your watch. And this is absolutely happening on Democrats and progressives' watch. Bail reform may not alone be the source of the problem, but combine it with a defund the police ethos that demonized law enforcement and a prosecutorial approach like Alvin Bragg's that declines to prosecute quality of life infractions and even gun possession, and suddenly all roads are leading to favoring criminals over their victims, which of course leads to more crime. There are also some more justifiable reasons for the taboo on discussing crime. The right spent years trying to shut down important conversations about police reform by asking, what about Black on Black crime? A racist deflection from an entrenched struggle Black Americans face to secure equality before the law. I think there is also genuine cause for concern for mass incarceration, both from a fiscal and a spiritual point of view. But just 1 in 5 people in prison or jail are there for a nonviolent drug offense. Nearly 3/5 of people in state prison are there for violent offenses. Decarceration attempts all too often end up sending these people back into poor communities of color, where they continue to prey on the weak. It's time to ask, Are progressive pieties really enough to outweigh the thousands and thousands of victims of violent crime? Can we not both decry the murder of George Floyd and the drive-by shooting of his 4-year-old niece? Shouldn't the very thing that makes people, myself included, hesitant to talk about race and crime make us all the more anxious to defend its victims? Here to help me answer these really difficult questions is a brilliant, brilliant man, Wilfred Riley, assistant professor of political science at Kentucky State University and author of the books Taboo and Hate Crime Hoax. Welcome, Wilfred. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, Batya. I hope I don't disappoint after that intro.
So your work focuses on exactly these questions, why there is a taboo on talking about these really important realities on the left. Walk us through the argument. What have you found in your research? Why is it so hard to talk about this?
Well, I think you covered a lot of this. I mean, so the reality of where crime occurs really isn't that much disputed. And I mean, you made this point already at great length. But I mean, when you talk about a quote-unquote red state murder problem, the large majority of the murders in red states are concentrated in blue voting, heavily minority districts, and there are complex reasons for this. And I'll just say, as an African-American man, part of this very bluntly, for a couple of reasons. I mean, past racism, we're much younger as a population, often decades younger, we're more urban. The African-American crime rate overall is about 2.4 times the white crime rate. This isn't disputed. You can just go to the Bureau of Justice Statistics annual report, pull up that figure. So the main reason for the difference in crime between red and blue states is demographic. The majority of red states are in the South, where not only is there an honor culture, not only are there many poor white Latino Americans, many groups struggling with crime, but you also just have a much larger black population percentage. And adjusting for that younger, more urban community, that closes the gap almost entirely. In fact, in the one crude model I've run on this, it reverses it. So this argument that just sort of standard Republican areas, North Dakota, are going to be very violent is, whether you like the pachyderms or not, that's just not accurate. And I think most people at some level know that's not accurate. The New York is more dangerous than North Dakota. Why is it taboo to talk about this? Because I think of the incredible taboo against saying anything that could be construed as quote unquote blaming the victim on the left. I mean, it's simply obvious that whether you're talking about working class Appalachian communities, which are all around me in Kentucky, which has quite a high crime rate, or you're talking about the hood, bluntly, inner city black communities, there are cultural, situational reasons for all this crime. But saying this isn't a result of contemporary racism, that's very taboo on the left. Many of my progressive friends, even in academia, have trouble expressing that. But the simple reality is that when you don't talk about that, when you don't talk about the reality that good, integrated police forces reduce crime, a lot of people die. And that's what we're seeing now. And that's why we're seeing this incredible, 720-degree triple axel pirouette from the people on the political left, like Hochul, who'd been at least nodding along with defund the police until recently, back toward sort of a tough on crime attitude. But we'll see how close they get to actually discussing the real issues here. The red state murder problem, quote unquote, is not the issue.
I think there are a couple issues here we're all kind of hitting at. One being, as you just kind of mentioned, the age discrimination of so much crime in our cities and other places. We're talking about people, broadly speaking, between the ages of 15 and 30, a lot of them teenagers, a lot of them being failed by kind of social structures, after school programs, not having communities, church, things that in another generation would have brought, at-risk youth back from the brink. That being one issue, and then another being, as far as I can tell, an extraordinary mental illness problem, or mentally ill people, living in the streets, not being treated and engaging in violence, who should be, even if it's not going to be captured by the criminal justice system, then by a mental health facility or something like that. Are those two categories getting worse? Are we doing less now to deal with those two categories of crime that from what I can tell, make up a large proportion of the rise in crime that we're seeing?
I think so. I think there's another elephant in the room here, though, which is the recent post-George Floyd, quote-unquote, defund the police movement. I mean, during kind of the Black Lives Matter era, we've seen, and the most reliable crime data is on murder. So let's talk murder. We've seen an incredible surge in American homicides. So murders have gone from 14,194 in 2014, when the Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin protest period really began, to about 21,000 today. And we see a particular spike in murders, which took us over 20,000 just after Mr. Floyd was killed, murdered, I think we've all said, frankly, in early 2020. So the reason, there's actually a sort of a causal mechanism, as we would say here. I mean, myself, Bob Moranto, and Pat Wolf at the University of Arkansas actually wrote an academic paper looking at this. And one of the things you find is that police stops, regular broken window style interactions with the citizenry, those dropped by about 40% across at least those major cities we were able to measure, starting at this time, starting in May, June of 2020. And since then, you've seen a 44% increase in homicides. I mean, the graphs track almost perfectly. So I think we've always failed poor kids to some extent. I don't mean to be sarcastic about that, but I think there's something else that's going on right now. And mental illness, yeah, that's a big part of this. I mean, when you look at the homelessness issue in cities like Portland or my hometown of Chicago, I don't think this is going to be resolved just with the assignment of housing. I mean, you're talking about many long-term drug problems. Mm-hmm. You're talking about people who are homeless, in many cases traveling to places like the West Coast to be homeless there. But you have an intersection of these issues, because at the same time mental illness is growing, at the same time both the left and the right, for different reasons, don't want to address homelessness. You're also seeing depolicing. So, I mean, the plain fact is you had loitering and vagrancy laws in most cities until the modern era, the 70s, the 80s, that were pretty rigorously enforced. So it's not actually as though there's no way to clear up an encampment of 800 tents that's across the street from the city courthouse in, say, Portland. The problem is that there's a lack of the main, if you will, the will to do that. And I think as people get tired of stepping around needles and dodging muggers and so on in major cities, we're going to see that will come back. And if the Democrats are not willing to commit to doing that, I think you're going to see a lot more Republicans elected in urban areas than you otherwise would have. So yeah, your points are very good ones, but I also think that just the lack of cops is the big factor there. That 40% drop and that 40% rise, those aren't coincidences.
Well, can I ask you, there is, of course, a racist way to talk about this. Breitbart used to have a tag for black on black crime. Like, that's obviously a racist way to address what is an important topic. What would you say to leftists, progressives, people like me who care so much about this, but feel really uncomfortable talking about it, feel like, the people who have brought this up because the left won't, end up being people who you really don't want to be in the same company as? How would you tell people, like, why it's important to care about this and how to talk about it?
Well, that's a great question. And the answer is because facts matter. And if you don't address real facts, you end up chasing ghosts while people die. I mean, so I will say one thing about the Breitbart black on black crime tab. I mean, to some extent, that was a joke. What they were doing was saying that the media was focusing so intently on these rare outlier cases. I mean, police brutality, whites murdering black people, so on down the line, that they were ignoring this graphic reality of street violence in the city. So without defending Breitbart, really, I mean, they weren't posting black on white crimes. They were just saying over and over again, look, here's a tax-paying citizen that was killed. And I mean, this is a reality. I mean, in my book, Taboo, I look at actual patterns of interracial crime, because in the American upper middle class, again, for 2 or 3 years, we heard about Barbecue Becky and Pool Party Paula, more seriously, Dylan Roof, just constant Caucasian attacks on black people. So we take a look at the actual data there. And what I find is, first of all, violent crime involving whites and blacks, i.e. a black attacker or a white attacker, is about 3% of all serious index crime. I mean, the year I looked, there were 20 million crimes. Only 600,000 fit that very specific bill. But more to the point, interracial crime was also 80% black on white. So there's this simple refusal, as you mentioned, on the part of a lot of well-intentioned progressives to look at the reality, to look at the data, and that's why the right-wing media started mocking that. But in terms of how to address it, I guess my simple point is facts aren't racist. If you look at something, even the margins, if either Vidare or Jacobin says something, that might not be who you're going to cite in your academic article, but if you look that up and it turns out to be real, and it turns out there is a crime problem in whatever community, I've mentioned poor white communities, Latino communities as well, it's foolish to pretend that that's not real. It's foolish to pretend that the real issue in America is sort of upper middle class whites abusing black people when you're looking at these murder numbers.
Well, Professor, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
We'll be back with more Rising right after this.